So I guess no need to introduce Dean, but I'll just say that for those who don't know, disruptive analysis in consulting, I believe not only service providers, but a lot of service providers and vendors in that space. And Dean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but had the first report for WebRTC.
Yeah, I think so.
And continue to release those reports regularly. So
Yeah.
we're going to hear from Dean about WebRTC by numbers.
So I'm quite glad that Doug is dealing with this. Doug's already taught me how to do one thing so far this year, which was learn to surf. I didn't look like he does on the pictures. However, learning how to play with a laptop with a French interface is challenging. We've also lost the cursor there. That's not plugged. That's not plugged in. Okay. When we finally get the slides come up, thanks to Amir doing the introduction this morning and Doug just now, I don't have to do a general sort of state of the WebRTC industry presentation. So what I'm going to be doing is talking through some of the numbers. And I've been doing forecasts on WebRTC for quite some time now, about a year and a half. But I wanted to talk through a little bit more about what's behind them, what we can do going forwards, and how that applies to different sorts of businesses, and what they might want to do in terms of, that's it. Excellent. Right, in terms of what businesses need to know in order to develop business plans which are realistic. Because it's very easy to come up with big numbers. And I see this all the time in the mobile industry where everyone is always talking about, oh, there's 7 billion subscribers or subscriptions or SIM cards. Actually, that is irrelevant. The larger the number, the less relevance there is to any one individual or company. So, who am I? I've been an analyst for more years than I want to think about, and I've been following WebRTC pretty much since day one. And I've been publishing research on it since March of last year, when I put out a fairly large document trying to estimate the number of devices and potential users for various things, as well as look at some of the qualitative factors. I've updated that recently, and what I'm trying to do, looking at the size of the WebRTC market, is two things. One is top-down analysis of how many possible users are there for WebRTC applications or services or functions or capabilities. That doesn't necessarily mean paying subscribers. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who is capable of using WebRTC actually will. But there's a range of different devices, and by looking at both browser adoption and also the sort of native implementations of WebRTC of various sorts, either when they come straight out of the box with things like the web view in the next version of Android, or where WebRTC is bundled into an app using a third-party SDK, you can come up with some reasonable expectations for what the current and future universe of WebRTC devices is going to be. Those numbers are reasonably firm. We can debate on, which quarter is Microsoft going to release ORTC in IE, and how quickly are they going to replace their installed base. But it's fairly predictable to a reasonable amount. Harder is how many people actually use WebRTC. And really there, you have to do it from looking at individual use cases. So whether that's looking at enterprise users doing conferencing, whether it's looking at telecom providers where people are using WebRTC to extend a VoLTE service onto a PC, whether it's a contact center, there's a lot of different separate categories. And one of the things I think over the next year is that's going to grow even farther. I've got a couple of icons at the bottom of examples where WebRTC is already being used. And some of those are big volumes of large numbers of individual people, but perhaps a low value that could be ascribed to each one. So perhaps a Snapchat user. Whereas it might be that a contact center agent on WebRTC ends up touching multiple people on the course of a day using that technology, and clearly has been an investment by the contact center manager in that infrastructure. I think it's important as well not to be too purist and say, oh no, WebRTC, it's just about the browser, it's just about the WebRTC APIs. As Amir was saying this morning, to be honest, the key thing here is democratization of communications. It's embedded communications into apps and websites. And that's going to be using ORTC, it's going to be using APIs from Twilio and Topbox and the other platform as a service providers we saw earlier on. It's going to be embedded into Internet of Things and set-top boxes. It's not just going to be the browser-to-browser video calling that we're used to seeing. One of the things when you do numbers and anything to do with the web is browser statistics. And they are, having spent a lot of time crunching through the numbers, whenever you see browser statistics, the first thing in your mind should be, why is this wrong? Because if you add together all the browsers that everyone claims, you probably get to about 2 times the total number of internet users on the planet. If you look at them in detail, half of them are about individual users. Some of them are about usage and page hits. What is the sample they've got? For example, I've seen very few things which return the dark grey bar at the top, which is a Chinese browser called Qihoo 360, which apparently has 300 million users all on its own, but uses different rendering engines. So there's an awful lot of smoke and mirrors about the numbers. You can make reasonable predictions. I mean, I've sort of projected out what I think is going to happen. To be honest, from a WebRTC point of view, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference whether people use Chrome or Firefox. So the ultimate outcome on this is fairly predictable. Obviously, on tablets and on smartphones, it's a slightly different matter because you have to try and predict out the number of devices on iOS, on Android. With Android, you've then got a difference between Chrome browsers that's pre-installed, the later versions where you have WebRTC capability in the web view, and the same thing versus when Apple may or may not adopt WebRTC in iOS or third-party browsers from, well, Bowser or whatever. The chart you've seen, I mean, I've modified this over the course of the last year. The sort of headline number is that at the moment there's sort of, I think it's about 1.4, 1.5 billion theoretical devices. Now, this does not mean users. These means devices which are capable of using WebRTC through their primary browser. So I'm discounting if you're an IE user and you've got Chrome somewhere installed on your PC and you fire it up once every 3 months, I'm not counting it. I've got a fairly conservative figure for Internet of Things and also TV at the top of the slide. I mean, the question that Amir just asked, my view is that where you see IoT devices, WebRTC, will be those devices which have either a screen or ideally a screen and a camera or microphone. I'm not convinced that you're going to get WebRTC being used for data channel in a small pressure sensor on an oil pipeline. But you may well see it on a vending machine where there's a sort of a help button if it steals your money and it's got a screen. I think that the sort of higher-end machine-to-machine use cases, particularly ones where you've got a visual or auditory display, are much more likely. So you can imagine a CCTV camera with an inbuilt speaker and microphone might be an example. The sort of big number at the end of this, for what it's worth, is about 6 billion devices in 5 years' time. The interesting thing there is that a lot of people will have multiple devices, particularly in Western Europe and North America. When I've actually looked at this by region, and when you drill down, you'll probably find that the average person in North America will have 2 WebRTC-capable devices, whereas in Asia, taking Asia as a whole, even including developed Asia like Japan and Singapore, it's going to probably be more like 0.6. So although the overall number of WebRTC possible users will be concentrated in Asia, it's going to be spread much more thinly outside of a couple of hotspots, let's say like Japan and Singapore and Korea. One thing I always get asked is, yeah, all this is great, numbers, how many users, how many devices, but what about value? How big is the what's the WebRTC market worth? Can you put a dollar figure on a euro figure? And sometimes I also get asked, what's the equivalent figure in minutes from people with a legacy telecoms background? And the answer is, it's hard. The problem with WebRTC is there are so many use cases, and also there's so many layers of the stack when you're looking at, say, platform as a service versus doing things internally, that saying, what's the market worth? Well, what's the market worth of HTML? Yeah, it's a meaningless question. And WebRTC is very much the same, where there's so many different ways of creating a WebRTC application or platform or service that trying to put one big number on it is irrelevant. And this sort of fits back into something that I've been calling delamination as a wider trend in communications, where what we might have thought of, and this isn't quite a typical OSI stack, but it's what you might have thought about as the components of a communication service in the past. That is sort of becoming sliced up at a horizontal level. There are companies out there that are offering just firewall traversal services, just testing services, just analytics services, storage, which may be used for WebRTC content or something else. You might find transcoding as a service carved out at one point. And the question is then, how do you ascribe the value here to WebRTC? It's extremely hard, unless you do it for a particular company or a particular segment, and you're prepared to spend the time to actually think really long and hard about what is my addressable market for the application I'm trying to build or the platform service I'm trying to provide. There's a reason for this. The blue button, if I come here a year ago, the blue things on this chart were what were vendors and platform providers doing with WebRTC. And there were some fairly well-defined categories. You had a bunch of gateways, which typically came from either IMS vendors or SBC vendors or some enterprise-centric companies where they've added a WebRTC gateway capability. There were a few standalone media servers, unified comms platforms, and on the services side, over to the right, there were some defined verticals like video chat and the sort of API platforms, the top boxes and Temesises and Twilios of this world. But now, come back and look at this year, and all of these companies have moved into each other's spaces. We heard this morning about, say, Gemband, which we would have thought of as a gateway provider last year, now has a platform as a service with Candy. We found that some of the API providers have done vertical integration. So OpenClove has a video recruitment tool where they've built the application themselves. Topbox does some customer service stuff. And you've seen a lot of other entrants which have tried to pick a space that's unoccupied on this chart. And I'm pretty sure if I come back in a year's time, it's going to be pretty much entirely covered in. And that, again, means that as long as you can define exactly where on your chart, you are on the chart, you can come up with a relatively relevant number for your market opportunity. But at the moment, if you're just trying to take a blanket figure, you end up including half of the world's IMS infrastructure or half the world's call center infrastructure, as well as on the API side, a lot of non-WebRTC stuff that various of the companies do. And this also means that some of the historic stats that we've used are no longer relevant. And I think you have to start thinking in terms of new metrics, whether it's sessions rather than minutes, whether it's conversations might be relevant for some. This one, as an example, I've just used is a company called Zone that's doing online WebRTC music lessons. And although they probably sell by the hour, it's still not necessarily, unless you're the provider of the sort of hosted back end who's charging by the minute, thinking about this in terms of the traditional telephone or telecoms metrics is not particularly helpful. The same thing as we go towards Internet of Things gets even more complicated. Are minutes of use relevant? I mean, that's a picture of Ericsson's sort of Oculus Rift attached to their mechanical digger. That's actually me at CTIA a couple of months ago. And that's actually not going across the public network at all. And in that instance, looking at minutes as a metric for how useful that is wrong. You'd probably think about it in terms of number of seats, number of working days, or whatever the relevant number is. The same thing with various other devices which have had WebRTC integration. So Well, I'm not going to go through all of this, but when you start looking at things use case by use case, you can start making more sensible comments on what do you mean by a WebRTC adoption and what do you mean by WebRTC growth. So for certain things, it's obvious. If I am using WebRTC to extend a telco's VoLTE service onto a laptop, then probably minutes or calls is a useful number. If it's contact centers, then agent positions on the agent side, or perhaps calls, inbound calls, if it's an inbound call center on the customer side is relevant. There's other things you can do around education, where perhaps you're talking about a number of institutions, number of events. I was at the Terrainer event yesterday, and they were talking about number of hours of video conference, both in terms of server hours and user hours. So there's a lot of thought that goes into looking at the relevant metrics. And if you're a provider of if you're a vendor providing into that, you probably also need to build a fairly complex model to understand your addressable market here. Gets even more complex for things like data channel CDNs, where you're probably thinking in terms of data volumes. So just to throw one set of numbers out there that I've been thinking about was enterprise. And at the moment, if you think about enterprise communications, the usual thing to think about is seats of either a PBX or a unified communications platform. Globally, there's about 300 or 400 million seats of, for want of a better term, phone system, including IP. About half of them have converted to IP in one form or other, either as IP PBX or a unified comms platform. And sort of when you start looking into the addressable market here, the main market for that type of enterprise user, you could probably call them knowledge workers, people who actually spend their working career using information, making phone calls as part of their business. They probably have a business email address. And that's different to, say, maybe a taxi driver who might take bookings on the phone, but you wouldn't describe them as a knowledge worker. Grey area around an Uber user, perhaps, who's driven off an app. And looking out to where we see WebRTC appearing in UC systems, and also in things like the conferencing, and appearing embedded into applications, line of business applications, SAP, you can start making some rational conclusions about where WebRTC will get used either occasionally or regularly. And I'll make the equivalent here on the consumer web is daily average users and monthly average users, DAUs and MAUs. And the way to think about it here is a regular user in a business context will have their main communications tool using WebRTC. So it might be using, let's say, the unified circuit for unified comms. Occasional use will be where perhaps they're invited as a guest to someone else's conferencing system, once a week or once a month or something like that. And whilst they will certainly be a WebRTC user, they may well have Chrome or Firefox as their browser, they will not be depending on WebRTC day in, day out. Just to give an overall number, I'm expecting by the end of 2019 around about 900 million workers touching WebRTC in one form or another, about half of them regularly and half of them occasionally. And then you have to think about that of, what does that mean as a vendor? And do we believe in the view that actually we'll have a business which has a unified communications sort of core where you have your identity, you have a UC platform, and all the other applications you might have as an employee are sort of hanging off of that using that mechanism? Or are we going to find businesses where there might be a UC and conferencing system, but actually people will find WebRTC embedded in their other applications? The medical practice, where the practice management application itself has a communications capability built in from a third-party tool. The oil field seismology application, where the field worker with a ruggedized laptop wants a video connection to the depot, and that's not necessarily going to be tied into the main unified comm system. It could well be a silo, and I think that the latter is starting to become more relevant as people are starting to go beyond bring your own device to bring your own communications. Where you find employees will start using their own choice of conferencing. They already do with Skype and Hangouts. But you may even find bring your own contact center in some cases. So big numbers. Overall, I think there's going to be upwards of 1 billion, perhaps as many as 2 to 2.5 billion people using WebRTC in one form or another in 5 years' time. And that's a sizable proportion of the overall internet population. But that's not necessarily going to mean that all of them use it regularly. So you'll find, particularly on consumers, some will have their favorite voice over IP tool is WebRTC based, and some will just use it once a month when they dial into their bank, or not even dial into their bank, use the video call button in their banking application or their favorite airlines application. So I think that if you're a vendor in today, it's important to understand the difference between regular user and occasional. Telco users, I think, is going to get up to about 500 million. There's going to be some, probably about 150 million on my estimates, that will be using a basic extension of voice over IP. So that's either VoLTE or fixed voice over IP, where you have that service provider personality projected onto a laptop or a tablet, for example. You will see a number of telecom operators deploying WebRTC in their own sort of OTT-style applications, where they're trying to maybe not compete with Skype, but offering their own equivalent calling or social service. So here you have things like Telenor's Appearin, for example, which is small at the moment, but as an example of what we might see in the future. You also have their interesting possible outliers of huge possible upside, where you see things like Telefonica providing the communications engine for Firefox Hello. You know, if that happens to be a viral hit, that could have 100 million users in a year's time. I don't know yet if it's going to, but you have to bear in mind when looking at the statistics that there's a large amount of variability. It only takes Skype to flip the switch, and next time you upgrade the app, it's WebRTC, and the number leaps. So you already see this with Snapchat, for example, which acquired AdLive. Snapchat is probably the largest user base for WebRTC at the moment, since they started adding real-time video into the app. Actually, I was talking to someone from a telco earlier on, and that came out as from their analytics of their network traffic as the largest group of users. I'd expect also to see Hangouts, Amazon Mayday, maybe Vonage as being the sort of the larger active user bases today. But I think that if we come back in a year's time, we should probably have a couple of other big name brands in there as well. So just to sort of point out, the world isn't only going to be WebRTC here either. This is a chart of overall internet user base and people who are using, this is voice over IP users, people who are using application embedded voice over IP. At the moment, there actually are already people doing contextual communications, but not with WebRTC. So if you're playing a multiplayer game and you've got voice chat in the game, that's not WebRTC based today, but it's existing. The same thing, it's very easy to think of WebRTC as the only game in town to extend carrier voice over IP and VoLTE, but it's not. There are people who have SIP soft phones, we have Wi-Fi calling, which is built into the device. So I think it's going to be interesting here to see whether WebRTC takes market share in those individual use cases. So, to conclude, definitions and assumptions are critically important here. Yeah, yes, I know I and everyone else put out big numbers because that's what people like to see. It's like they want to have a chart with a hockey stick on it. But to understand what the relevance is to your business is you need to go into those numbers and look at how does this apply to my addressable market. So it's no particular use knowing there's going to be 2.5 billion WebRTC devices in Asia if you haven't localized to Chinese and sort of various other languages which you would have to. That is not addressable by your application. Same thing is thinking about how you deliver those applications to the market in terms of whether you are a vendor looking to provide a paid service or whether it's freemium. There's a big difference between use cases, and I think that it's WebRTC's strength, and from a forecasting point of view, it's a nightmare. There are certainly very, very different things that are going on in terms of looking at a call center versus looking at voice and video embedded in a game versus tele-education or healthcare package or a customer service app for a bank. They all have very different dynamics, and they're driven by their specific verticals. Also true of the telecoms industry. If you're looking to build a business plan, you have to really drill in and think about what's your relevant audience, what devices do they use in your territories, and where is their source of potential revenue there. Internet of Things, machine-to-machine, TV, make it even more complex. TV I haven't talked about, but there's actually going to be some interesting evolution around set-top boxes and IPTV for WebRTC as well. And then there's the platform providers we heard talk about this morning. And there I think that we will see some numbers. I think that is an interesting addressable market. If you take all the possible flavors of WebRTC and associated services that go around building those platforms, in the medium term, I think there's probably opportunity in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, perhaps with support consulting, looking out to the end of the period, getting up towards the sort of theoretical addressable billion-dollar market, but it's not going to be the scale of the sort of, say, the telecoms industry today. So, yeah, your last thing is to think about suitable metrics and indicators. And on that last point, I really like to encourage people, if you have useful and interesting numbers, I am more than happy to sign an NDA. I can feed stuff into the aggregate forecast. I'm happy to work with you to feed back stats on what does the market actually look like, because there's very, very little hard data because of how fragmented it is. So if you get a chance, my contact details are on this slide, or I'm around for the next couple of days. And quick plug, that's my research report with all this in it as well. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Any questions? Okay.
With this new concept of bring your own application, when each application can place a call, don't you think that the user experience is worse than from what we know today as one number? For example, I'm working in a business application X. Mm-hmm. I understand that I need to call you to resolve some question. Then it means that I can call you only if application X, when a client of application X is loaded into your browser. But actually, I want to call you whatever device you are on.
Well, that depends whether the term call is relevant in that particular situation. And I think it's going to be very, very application specific. In certain instances, you will know that the person's there. It might be the hotel management app, and you're the cleaner in room 320, and you want to tell the person downstairs on the front desk that there's a fault with the shower, and can you send the maintenance engineer? And at that point, it's a fairly closed system. You know there's someone around. You don't have to think, oh, they might be sort of down the street. Whereas if it's something where you are not certain, and here it's going to come down to the individual application developer to make that choice. So if you're the oil field services application developer, or you're the hotel application, or you're SAP, or something which is working with the doctor and the MRI scanner, whatever it happens to be, you will be making those design choices. Do I need to have communications which is completely interoperable with the phone network? Does this concept of a phone call make sense? Or is it more like conferencing where it's to a place rather than a person? There's no hard and fast decision. So I think you will see an increasing amount of fragmentation for individual use cases which make the decision based on their audience that they don't need to interoperate, or they don't need this idea of I call you. It might be we both meet at a time and a place.
Okay, thanks.
One more question because we need to move on. Victor, you? You can ask him afterwards.
Okay, so with WebRTC, we have a new building block to create services. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, we have all these discussions about net neutrality going on in Europe and US. You wrote a fantastic article about this. What do you think? What's the connection between the two topics? Because on one side, we are going to increase the traffic in the network, all this traffic is being encrypted, so we cannot optimize it in the service provider network. So how would you connect the two dots?
I think, to be honest, I think that most service providers have other things to worry about other than WebRTC at the moment at its current volumes. If you're a fixed operator, you're probably more worried about Netflix and large amounts of stream video, which is 6 gig an hour for HD video. If you're a mobile operator, slightly different. You're probably thinking more about partnering with WhatsApp or Facebook or perhaps trying to run your own internet application. Now, there is a possibility that in some countries around the world which are not very voice and video friendly, that they might start looking for DTLS or other telltale signs in their DPI and doing something with it. I doubt that's likely to be the case in Western Europe and North America, just because, well, there's another segment here for WebRTC lawyers, which I suspect would do well in that case. I think that in other parts of the world, it is going to be something we have to look out for. Now, do I think that WebRTC is likely to be either prioritized or deprioritized under a non-net neutrality regime? Some might try it. There's a carrier doing their own service. But even there's a problem that on fixed networks, it's not really necessary. And on mobile networks, depending which country you're in, between 50 and 80% of the time, you're on someone else's Wi-Fi anyway, so it doesn't help. So, is anyone going to pay to have the traffic prioritized 30% of the time when, in fact, you might be 4 walls from the outside of the building and the gating factor is network coverage and radio, and I'm unconvinced.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next.